Welcome back to the show. We're about to learn the secret sauce. Zeno, how you doing?
Pretty good.
Yeah,
thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for taking the drive over. And how long you been in the Bay Area now?
A little bit over a year now.
Excellent. And you came from LA, right?
Yeah.
So what's your opinion? Difference?
I actually absolutely love it here.
Really?
I
Okay.
feel like a lot of people on X like to talk trash about the city. But just like any other city, there are good places, bad places, and I just love the energy here. Super cool.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. And have you been to Oakland yet?
Yeah, a couple places. I still need to explore a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah. On your way out, Pixar is right over there. So you can drive by the lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just for context, where we record, folks, right next to Pixar.
That was like my dad's dream. Like, oh, I really want you to work at Pixar. That was like his whole thing.
You can still do it.
Yeah.
Like, it's still a chance. You just gotta, maybe they'll buy a Resend.
Yeah, I'm sure they need to do like some open source there. So okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so you do open source. Shows about the secret sauce. We have folks who are doing open source, open source adjacent, founders, maintainers. And actually, I knew you of React Email first because that was a thing that kind of made waves. So I want to actually start there, about React Email and what that does and why it got started.
Yeah, that was a very interesting project because with email, it's this kind of thing where everybody needs to send an email, but it's so freaking hard to do it.
Yeah.
And I feel like we come from the same generation of web development where to build a website that will look the same in every browser, it was so painful. You had to build some specific CSS code to work on Firefox and Internet Explorer 6 and Chrome. And we don't really have those problems anymore, right? Like in 2024, we just build the same code. It works everywhere. And just like a couple of years ago, I had to build an email template myself again. And I was like, wow, it didn't evolve at all. It feels like the web in 2010. So React Email came out of this idea of if we had to build email in 2024, 2023, how would that look like? And it looks like, use tools like React and Tailwind and TypeScript. So we try to, bring that tooling to email. And yeah, it's been pretty wild so far.
Yeah. So zooming back, because you did some React stuff. I'd love to set the stage for how you got to doing React and eventually starting a company, going to YC. But in passing, so we just had Zeke on, and you mentioned that you know Zeke from back in the day. Node. What's your connection to open source? How did you get involved in it?
Yeah, I actually started in a very closed source environment with Flash. Okay. And that was my first experience with programming. And I absolutely love it, just being able to build stuff on the client side, things that people would be able to perceive and experience directly. That was something that really attracted me. And, I got that transition from Flash to HTML5 very early on in my career. And I've always had that idea of I want to be the best of whatever I do, right? And with, other programming languages like PHP or Java, it will be so freaking hard to be the best one because those languages were there forever. But with HTML5, there was this realization of if I move super fast and if I dedicate myself super hard into this problem, maybe I can be the best in this area. Turns out there's no such thing as the best in any programming language. There's no finish line. But that got me exposed to the idea of building for the open web. And I started playing with Canvas, started building experiments. And with those experiments, I started to make them open source. Got into jQuery very early on and built my first open source project called jQuery Boilerplate back in 2011. This one is actually pretty. Do you want to hear the story of this one?
I mean, I did jQuery myself, and so I don't think I remember the boilerplate, but maybe I do. Might not remember the name.
Yeah, this was interesting because I wanted to build a jQuery plugin myself. And I was like, okay, I'm sure there's a pattern that I can follow. And I couldn't find anywhere else. So I'm like, oh, maybe I should build a pattern. But I didn't have any experience building jQuery plugins myself, right? So like here I was trying to build that. And the way I approach it is the same way that I approach open source these days. I definitely spend a lot of time building the actual library, but everything around it needs to be at the same level of quality. So I built like a nice website, I bought a domain, and I just published on Twitter. I didn't have any following. This was in 2011. And Smashing Magazine picked it up.
Oh, nice.
And I was like, no way. Like Smashing Magazine tweeting about my stuff. Oh my gosh. And it got a lot of traction. And then like some of the influencers in the Node ecosystem, in the JavaScript ecosystem, started looking it up. And there was one particular person, I'm not going to name that person, but he saw the project and sent me a PR. And the PR was titled, "Everything is wrong about this. So delete everything and start over again." And the whole PR was just like deleting all the files.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa, what's happening? And I was so surprised. I was definitely like, a little bit shocked. And I was like, oh, what do I do now? That's when I got connected to Adios Money, who was, working at AOL and like such a influential person in the JavaScript world. And we started like, okay, how can we make this better? And then we relaunch it. But that was like one of my first experiences with open source, being exposed to like a negative angle of it.
Yeah.
But also the realization that, there's definitely ways that we can do stuff better. And I ended up accepting that PR. So.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And starting over with like a more jQuery flavor of setting up templates.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's wild. Okay, yeah. So I guess I do remember that. I never built my own plugin, but I used a ton of plugins, as you do in jQuery. But yeah, fascinating. Like, everyone's got their own journey and how they get started. And like Flash was the thing that I was aware of. Actually, my twin brother was a bigger Flash developer and like did the WYSIWYG and built like games and stuff like that. And I was more of a consumer and like kept up the speed. I did more copying, pasting of JavaScript eventually.
That's awesome.
But yeah. Wow. So yeah, so you got the Node ecosystem. You got your literally your teeth cut.
Yeah.
In open source from getting contributions. So what was after that?
It was interesting because that experience really taught me like the power of like learning from others, right? And because I was inserted into that world and I was like now understanding how open source would work, I just kept building things and launching. So I got, involved in the web components standards, and I started building this project. And I started just paying attention to new APIs that the browser would implement. So I remember one day there was a new API for copy to clipboard, which traditionally was only done through Flash. And I was like, oh, finally, this is coming to the web, thankfully. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I should, create a library around that. And I created this project. This was back in 2015. Created a project called Clipboard.js. Up until now, I think there's like 33,000 GitHub stars.
I forgot you did that because I totally use that in a lot of projects for sure. But yeah, 100%. Yeah, love that.
And that was another example of like I remember spending maybe like 3 weeks in that project before launching, and I spent like maybe a week in the library and 2 weeks on the website and the README. And that's like such like the opposite of where most people spend their times on. But, just the act of like thinking about every little section on your README, how that flows, how easy it is to get started. Where would people, maybe have a question or another? Where can they copy and paste code? Because, as developers, we just want to get up and running, that's the beauty of, Tailwind and Shad CNUI. Like, that was just like the thing that I really recommend folks to explore.
Yeah, so like you were early on this trend because now it feels like I want to have Stephen Tay on board with the podcast and talk about Dub, but also talk about his journey and eventually to DevRel at Vercel, because like there is a bit of polish that is needed for open source now. Like it's not just like you can throw a project up there and like just put it out there for the world, and that's totally fine. But if you're looking to like see some adoption or get some interest, there are some clear things and strategies like you can go tweet at it, or you can go like go get a bunch of stars. But even like stars, like trying to fetch stars from folks on GitHub, it still needs to be like the story. Like, what can I copy and paste and get this running as quick as possible? And I think a lot of like the JavaScript world that I come from, but even like the Ruby world, there is a tent of like at least names or a thing. So like you could name it something that makes sense. And like we moved away from like this like the random like pizza JS and like have to figure out what does that mean. So things are descripted now, but I think a README and a website help for the adoption. So like a lot of, so Clipboard.js, you did React email, like you see what's the inflection point where you see folks have jumped into a project and then they're starting to use it, and then you see adoption. Like, I would love to talk about more about that.
It's interesting because there's so many open source projects in the world, and in order to stand out, is not only about writing the best code possible. I feel like most people think about open source, like the end of open source is Git push, like, oh, now the code is on GitHub. There's a repo. I'm done. And that's just the beginning of it. And there's a lot of things that maybe they might not start big, and that's fine. You know, that's how things go. Another project that I created, this was in 2016 or so, called Dracula, which is a theme for developers. Dracula nowadays has more than 6 million downloads only on VS Code, and there's like 300 themes. But Dracula started with one theme, you know, like, and I put it, you know, it was a ZSH theme, and I put it out there, and then another person started using, and then another person started using. The first year, no one really contributed, but then on the second year, I was still running the project, and then there are a few contributions here and there. So I feel like you just gotta keep going if you believe in what you're building. If you are taking, you know, advantage of what you're building, if that's helpful to you and a couple of your friends, that's already good enough, you know.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I have a DevRel background, so and I think when the storytelling aspect is the other thing. So like it's one thing having the README and like the copy and pasting thing, but like what's the ideal like the first touch someone sees this, what's the ideal use case? So like that, I think actually you do a pretty good job. Like we're Resend users now, and like we're React email prior for other projects, but like I get the use case. I get how I'd inject this into my project as fast as possible. And then I get to like scale and grow. So like if there's extensions and plugins, and like I get to learn that as the project grows or as my usage grows. And I think that sort of like storytelling aspect within the way you approach like your documentation, your websites, and your READMEs, it's like, here's the first taste. Like might not be what you want, but at least you can throw together something quick and have a proof of concept. And so like that's, and I honestly, I think I was at GitHub, and like we had this, I used to get all this conversation about like, how do I get my project famous? How do I get trending? And there's like really cool ways to like get trending really quickly. But like a lot of times what we're seeing, at least in the OpenSauced data, is like trends happen. And then a year later, it's like completely flat. And it really, it's like a testament of like, do people really need this? Like, do people like, there's a lot of attention in Hacker News and the initial adoption, but then nothing happened after that. And it's like it's not a bad thing. It's just an evolution of open source. So like you started React email, and then now it's a company. So like, how did you get from that to there?
And you appreciate this, you mentioned storytelling, right? I feel like that's such an important thing, and something that most people miss as well. When we started Resend, it was just an idea, like how can we create this type of email? It was just like an experiment.
That's a great tagline.
You know, like we were like, okay, let's play around with that. How would that look like? And we started exploring this as a side project. No big ambitions at all. Just like, let's play around with that. And as we were building, and we were like, oh, okay, it's working. Interesting. Oh, let me integrate with this other side project that I have. And then I sent to a friend of mine, and then he paid for it. I was like, oh, okay, maybe there's something here. And I remember like just thinking about, how are we going to be public about this? Are we just going to one day come up and say, okay, here's a way for you to send emails? Or what's the story? So we actually kind of like paused or just like slowed down Resend a little bit, started building React email, launch React email, and then launch Resend.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I saw React email first. Then I saw Resend, and I was like, wow, that was fast.
Yeah. So and I remember like writing, I can even show you later, like I have a Notion page called like master plan. And like there were just 3 bullet points. It was launch an open source project around email, establish ourselves as email experts, launch a SaaS on top of email. And that was the trajectory and even the flow of the user as we felt ourselves. Like, okay, first you need to build an email template. The designer sends you a Figma file with this beautiful template. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to build this. And then you start building. And then once you have that, now you need to send it. So here's how you can solve it. Here's React email. It's going to help you build that template. And then once you're ready to send, here's a platform that can help you send with React right away.
Yeah, and I guess it really comes down to like you had the plan, the 3 bullet points. But I think a lot of times, like sometimes we don't even have the plan. And I've worked with a lot of different engineers, and really great at writing code, really sometimes great at writing documentation. But like when you ask them like what's next or what's in the roadmap, that usually falls flat like pretty quickly. So like what in your background gets you to think about the broader vision and the picture, that even like think, okay, let's actually pause, open source something, and then relaunch on top of the open source project.
Yeah. I wish there was something deeper to say, but connecting to the first thing we talked about, my dad wanting me to work at Pixar. I just watched a lot of movies growing up. I've always loved thinking about the hero's journey, and like, okay, what is the beginning of the story? What's the struggle? What's the point in the story where the hero emerges, and what's the villain in that story, and how you can structure your thought around it. So yeah, I feel like I just gravitate towards that.
Which is, I mean, and this is like one of the best things about like, writing code's great, and like getting to have stuff in production is great, but also reading books and getting stories from other places and like getting innovation, like the whole Steve Jobs thing where, he sat in Stanford classes where he audited, like he didn't go get a degree. He just sort of sat in there and learned about design, and like got to learn all these early principles. And I know folks can go back and forth on like how much he actually did and how much he didn't do, but that's besides the point. Like my experience is like I have a finance degree, decided to go into sales because I couldn't get a finance job. And
I didn't know that. That's
like this is about you. But then I ended up getting my MBA, and then while getting my MBA, I learned how to code because I had an idea for an app. And then my entire trajectory of my career has been like storytelling around what I've been building. So every app I built to learn how to write Go is because I had a story that I had to solve, like which was I needed an app to tell me when there's a baseball game so I can avoid the bar.
Nice.
And that was a story, but then I learned how to do Lambda functions because I needed to text myself and send it to Twilio to basically tell me, hey, there's a baseball game. Don't go to the city. But yeah, so there's a thing I wanted to bring up about storytelling, which is like the starting of OpenSauced actually starts in Brazil.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I built OpenSauced around that time, 2019. I actually rewrote a bunch of stuff on our last product because it was always a side project. And I was in Brazil for a couple weeks learning how to do design in Figma.
Nice.
And in Brazil, we actually use this thing at GitHub where I could find developers anywhere in the world. So like I needed JavaScript developers in Sao Paulo, Python developers in Sao Paulo. We're going to do open source meetup.
Okay.
And we called this product, well, it wasn't even a product, sorry. It was like looker functions, templates, but we called it Cerebro as like tongue in cheek, like find any developer in the world. And that one experience of like getting 60 developers in Sao Paulo, and I had no context of like who was there. I had a couple people who I knew like Python who could invite other people, but it was like a success. So like every city I go into, I go look into like, hey, who can I hang out with and have dinner with? Yeah. And so that's like the baseline of OpenSauced is like, can you discover who's making code in different places? So like your jQuery template, like being able to discover that early on, like that's a fascinating thing. But anyway, I go back to that because I had no context of Brazil, and like even finding like Brazil is number 4 in growing countries for GitHub.
Wow.
So we spent a lot of investment doing stuff in Brazil at that point, and they did a Copilot launch
Really?
in Brazil recently for that same reason. I'll ask a question, developer in Brazil. Like, how is the community? Because like I feel like I saw a lot of the same people, like you and a few other folks in JavaScript space. But I know like there's a distance and like because English is not a thing that everyone jumps into. Like even it's not even taught schools, I don't think.
Yeah, no, and it's so difficult to get started because I remember growing up and wanting to learn more about the web. The amount of resources available to you are so little. Like you are relying on folks who are translating content. Like the person I learned from was this retired guy. He was like 60 plus years old. That was just like he was like a engineer that got tired, and then he was like, "Oh, let me like translate some W3C specs." And that's how you would learn. You know, there was no content available. So I really, I really appreciate everybody who came before me and like learn all these materials when there was almost nothing there, and made it available. And it's so challenging because like not being your first language and having to learn all these technical terms on top of this language that you also don't know. So it's difficult, but the community there is incredible. It's just like so vibrant. I remember like the events that we would go, like there's Brazil.js that just happened last week, and like 2,000, 3,000 people in the same room. It's wild to think about that. You go on stage, you see 2,000 people in front of you. It's just wild. So the community there is amazing. I love them.
Yeah. It's like you mentioned half your team's in Brazil.
Yeah.
And so like is to have, I guess, quote unquote, two offices, like US, SF, and then Brazil moving forward.
Yeah. The idea for me is like, I'm really grateful for the opportunity that I have and the fact that I came here and now I'm able to start my own company because there were people that gave me a chance before to work at a company outside Brazil and give that opportunity. So when I think about Resend, I'm like, that's one way of me to give back. That's an avenue that I can use. So when I started Resend, it was very clear to me, like we're definitely having like engineers in Brazil, and I really want to be able to expand there as much as possible. And that's the goal, and it works out well. Time zone is not a big deal. The whole company is remote. And yeah, we try to go there every year for offsite too. So
yeah, it makes
that's
sense.
fun.
You probably still have a lot of family in Brazil as well. Yeah, and being close to Sao Paulo, being a major city and a hub as well, not too bad. So seems like I find like a lot of these like post-pandemic remote first companies, like a little bit of the secret sauce is having a connection to another country to have an offsite team or have a place where you can bring in, because SF it's expensive. And like hiring an engineer local, it's possible being VC backed, but you unlock a lot when you can bring in like quality talent in other countries as well. So yeah, hats off to you to be able to tap into your home country and then also tap back in to like participate and do offsites there as well. Because like the Brazil economy it's doing well. Like it's better than most South American countries. But yeah, I can only imagine like Resend a year or 2 years from now, like what that actually looks like. Which I want to ask you that you all just crossed over 100,000 users. Congratulations. So like so we're talking like 18 months since inception.
Yeah, 15 months since we incorporated. We launched publicly 10 months ago.
Yeah. And that was your public launch, was that YC as well?
Right after YC.
Right after YC. Yeah. So like that's like pretty quick trajectory. So congratulations. Like that's amazing. But I think when you originally, well, I want to get into what's next, but I also mentioned my story of Resend because I was a Postmark user.
Oh, nice.
For years. Like Postmark really does well with WordPress stuff.
Yeah.
And I worked at Netlify early days, so we used Postmark there. So like that's what I know. It's either that or SimGrid.
Okay.
And I think there's like this evolution of these dev tools that are successful where you just go up and up market. So like enterprise, eventually too many features. I don't know how to get started. This used to be easier, but now it's like this polyglot experience. I don't know if this is what I need for my startup. And so we actually were exploring Postmark, and then Resend publicly launched. I'm like, dude, I got to use this thing. So we use it, and like we're a power user. Like we cross over our threshold every time we do an announcement email.
Nice.
So yeah, like happily paying user. But like, what's next for Resend?
Yeah. So yeah, Resend started because of that frustration of like all these email players that are now at a point where they simply don't innovate. They're not thinking about how we can make the entire ecosystem better. And for me, what I try to do with Resend is push the bar in terms of quality, not only for myself or for the team, but for the entire industry. So how can we make the entire dev tools industry better? How we can build products that are so good that people can't help themselves but talk about it. And we're very intentional about how we're going to approach Resend in the early days. We were going to focus only on developers. We're going to focus only on transactional emails. And the vision is much broader than that. We want to become a communications platform. So we're starting with email, but email is just one of the things we want to do. This is a multi-year vision. There's a lot that we still need to do on email. And we've been dealing with a lot of growing pains and scalability challenges to handle all the load. But I can see a world where we expand beyond that and can help folks communicate regardless of the channel they use.
Yeah. So like, how big is the team now?
7 people.
7 people.
Yeah.
So like, you guys had some like pretty public challenges like as of recent, and you've turned the corner on that, but now you've got bigger problems. You have bigger users. You got more people like hammering on the system. You've also got this open source component. So like, how do you sort of manage and maintain all this stuff?
Oh, it's so hard. It's so hard because maintaining a brand and trying to build a brand, which for me is what I really spend my time thinking about. Like, as the leader of this team, like I could be thinking about the team or the company, but I think about how we can create like an exceptional brand. And to create an exceptional brand, I need an exceptional product. And to have an exceptional product, I need an exceptional team. But it always starts with like how we can build this thing. And it's just, it's pretty challenging. Like we now have customers like Warner Brothers that are using the product. So how we can go and support their load, and customers that are sending 3 million, 6 million, 9 million emails a month. So it's definitely a long way in, but yeah.
Yeah, that's full circle. And you said Warner Brothers, like, I guess the goal would be get Pixar
that's true.
as a customer, which I guess possible. They have a great dev team over there.
Yeah.
I've known actually, my kid goes to school with one of the dads that works over there and built all the a lot of the open source. Well, it's not even open source, like the sort of, I don't think they use Blender, but it's like something very similar, like rendering. But yeah, he's way smarter than I am. Like that's intense stuff. But yeah, like pleasure, like walking through this journey and like learning about like all the stuff that you touched. Because again, like going into this, I did my research and like I've known you for I've known you for a bit, but also known you from afar for even longer. So stuff I forgot you all even did, like absolutely amazing, exceptional career trajectory. And I only imagine it's only up from here from what you're doing. So any advice for folks, they're sitting in Brazil or sitting in their home country, getting involved as an engineer, maybe thinking about open source, like what's your advice for folks who are listening right now?
Yeah. I feel like sometimes if you come from a place where it's not like the center of the world, if you're not in SF or New York or London or whatever it might be, you might think like, oh, maybe you're behind. Or if I don't know a specific language, if I don't know how to speak English that good, maybe I'm a little bit behind. I would challenge that assumption and maybe try to rethink, and maybe that's your superpower. Maybe that's how you're going to be able to stand out from others. There's this natural barriers that we have to go through if you come from not a privileged background, that you have to just go after. And that was how I felt growing up. That's how I felt coming into IC with 250 other companies that were like super good, with all these people from Stanford and Berkeley. And I was like, no, we're going in and we're going to be the best company in this batch, and we're gonna make it happen, you know. So yeah, think from that angle, and it's definitely not easy, but it's possible.
Yeah, well, appreciate you sharing your story and the journey, and folks, stay saucy.